Welcome back to Law News Network. I'm Heather Hansen. Happy Monday. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, we have been looking towards the Jessica Chambers murder trial for some time. I don't want to say looking forward because it's certainly a tragedy for her family and her friends and the people in that community. But it is a case that many of us have been watching from afar for many years. When her body was discovered, it made national news and was heavily covered. In that case, they are picking a jury on that case today. We will be keeping you posted here at Law News as to what's going on with that jury selection. As you know, jury selection is not normally televised, but as soon as they have a jury, they expect to start that trial, and we anticipate that that will happen tomorrow morning. In the meantime, though, throughout the course of today, we will be talking about that case, and we are so fortunate this morning to have our guest with us, Jessica Jackson Sloan. She is a number of things. She's an attorney. She is the mayor of Mill Valley, California, but most importantly, for the purposes of this conversation this morning, she is also the director of Cut 50, which she's going to explain to us what that is in just a minute, but I want to welcome Jessica. Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to talk to you about Cut 50 pretty in depth in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk to you just a little bit more generally about this Chambers case. I know that you've been looking into it, as have I. And I noticed this morning in reading the indictment that Quentin Tellis, the defendant in this case, has been convicted of other crimes. First, how do you think that will play in this particular trial?
So, it's never an easy thing to represent somebody who has a rap sheet, especially because this is Mississippi. I know they're picking the jury. It's going to be a jury that hopefully is able to lay aside anything they've heard about the case. But this was big news. This was a very gruesome case. Unfortunately, horrific case fact. So a lot of people were following it closely. It also was a case that took a little while to solve. I think Champion had said on 4 different occasions that they had the case solved and was wrong.
Let me just interrupt. For those of you who don't know, Jessica knows Champion is the DA in the case, the prosecutor.
Yes, so there were 4 different occasions where they said that they had solved it. It really wasn't solved. They ended up really having to look at cell phone data and evidence and try and figure out, who maybe was in the area at the time. But this was a really high-profile case, so a lot of people have heard about it, and the media has been covering it, talking about the defendant's gang affiliation and prior record and the fact that he had just gotten out of prison 2 months before. So hopefully the jury can lay that aside and give him a fair trial. But it certainly is something that's going to be on everybody's mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the indictment, and it indicates that he had been convicted of a felony, fleeing, and sentenced to 5 years for that. He was convicted of a burglary of a dwelling and sentenced to 5 years for that, and another burglary count in a different incident and sentenced to 8 years of that. How does someone like that end up back on the streets?
It depends state to state, but in Mississippi, they've also got very crowded prisons. They're also, letting people out. And unfortunately, the problem is not actually that he's ending back up on the streets. The problem is that while he's in prison, he's not getting the support he needs to change his life and make better choices when he comes out. So he is continuing to pose a risk to society, as evidenced not necessarily by this case, because we still don't know if he's guilty in this case, but as evidenced by the multiple arrests. Clearly, he's not getting the support he needs to actually make changes and be a productive citizen instead of committing crimes.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about Cut 50, because that plays very well into this conversation. And then I want to ask you something specifically about this idea that he's not getting the support he needs. But first, tell us what Cut 50 is.
So Cut 50 is a national bipartisan initiative to end mass incarceration, but also reduce crime. So the way our approach to this is that we translate local needs. We work with a diverse group of stakeholders, everybody from crime survivors to law enforcement to currently incarcerated to formerly incarcerated to local elected officials. We figure out what their community needs are to actually make our streets safer, and we translate that into state and federal criminal justice policies.
Now that sounds like something that may have actually helped someone like Quentin Tellis, because if you assume, let's just assume for a moment, the trial will tell us a lot more about this, but let's assume that he's found guilty. His first crimes that he was convicted of don't seem to have been in the same level of violence by any stretch of the imagination as this alleged crime is. Is that something that the statistics bear out, that perhaps when people go into jail, if and when they get out, they can actually be more violent and commit more serious crimes than the first crimes that brought them to jail?
Absolutely. We see this sort of pattern of escalated crimes and seriousness in a lot of cases. And unfortunately, like you said, it is in part with the system to blame. Our prisons are not a place of rehabilitation or any sort of atmosphere in which one can transform themselves. Instead, they're places that are overcrowded, where people who are incarcerated there lack access to medical care or mental health care that they might need. They fail to address the underlying reason why people are committing crimes. And they're actually very dangerous places. You can be very traumatized in prison. He was pretty young when he went to prison, right? So he sort of grew up there and likely was traumatized. I'm sure we'll hear more about it, or I hope we'll hear more about it from the defense as this trial progresses. But our prisons right now are places that actually escalate our crime because they're not helping people heal or rehabilitate when they get there.
What type of interventions actually are proven to help rehabilitation in jail? So what types of things do you at Cut 50? What do you recommend as opposed to what we're doing now?
Yeah, there's a lot of solutions out there, and people who are doing it the right way. Certainly the cognitive behavioral therapies have been extremely effective. We've even seen, some more conservative counties starting to use them in their probation departments to really help people figure out, why they have this sort of criminal mindset and how they can alter that to really start positive thinking and pro-social thinking and really integrate into society. So again, teaching people how to take accountability, how to recognize their causative factors, how to de-escalate their anger in that moment, and how to actually funnel that anger into something more productive and be able to advocate for themselves and de-escalate situations.
Let's talk a little bit about the fact that this was a capital case, and I know that you've had some involvement with some capital cases and have represented some people facing death row. Here, though it is a capital case because the murderer was convicted during the commission, allegedly, of a third-degree arson, it seems as though Champion, the DA, as you mentioned before, is not intending to pursue the death penalty in this case. Can you give us some speculation? I know that you haven't spoken to him, but some idea as to why that might be, and also, if this is not an appropriate death penalty case, is there an argument to be made that there is no case that's an appropriate death penalty case?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of surprising one, right? The capital murder charge against Tellis actually opened the door for a death penalty case, but Champion, the DA, said that the prosecution's not planning to seek the death penalty. So the capital charge, of course, like you said, was incurred because this was committed during a third-degree arson. Tellis has pled not guilty to all of this, but you're right. I think this could pave the way for the argument that there is not an appropriate case to make the death penalty argument in. This is really, really horrible facts in this case. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the community who do think that he should get the death penalty should he be convicted. But the death penalty, as we know, is really ineffective. It's extremely expensive to the county because you have a bifurcated trial. So you have one trial that decides guilty or not guilty. Then you have one trial that actually decides whether the person's going to live or if they're going to die. In that phase of the trial, there's a lot of evidence that comes in that speaks to their causative factors. It's mitigating evidence that the jury would then be required to weigh against the aggravating evidence. So again, I haven't spoken to Champion, and I'm not intimately familiar with what evidence he has, but I would imagine if he's making that decision, then he's seen something in the mitigation that makes him think that the jury would have some empathy there and weigh heavily against the aggravation in the case, which is the horrendous facts of this case. So, I think this is a calculation on his part. Again, taxpayers hate the fact that, so much money is being wasted in death penalty cases when you could put somebody in for life without any possibility of parole as opposed to death, which is essentially a death sentence to die in prison. The other thing about the death penalty is it really takes a lot of time, and it's not a healing process for anyone. So, you think of how this horrendous crime must have impacted that community.
Right.
To have somebody so young and full of life burned to death in such a gruesome manner, the community is hurt. It's not just her family who is in incredible amounts of pain. The whole community is hurt. There's a ripple effect from that crime, and dragging it on through a death penalty trial, and then through the appeals, and then through clemency, that's not going to lead to healing. Now, if he is guilty and he gets a life sentence and he goes away to prison forever, then the DA may feel that that is more healing for the community.
Well, right, and that's one of the points that I was going to make, that you've got a family. We had a reporter local to that area on last week with Caroline Pelosi, and we're having another reporter local to that area on later on this afternoon. But she spoke last week about the impact that this case has had on that community. And sometimes it's important to just have closure rather than to continue to sort of seek this eye for an eye idea. How much do you think the family had input into the decision whether or not to seek the death penalty in a case like this?
I do know there are district attorneys that will listen to the family when they have particularly stringent views one way or the other about the death penalty. Obviously, that can be a huge political force, I'll say, but it can make a difference. But yeah, the impact is huge. I grew up here in Marin County. Back in 1992, a man named Richard Allen Davis kidnapped and killed a girl named Polly Klaas. And I'll tell you, just over the weekend, I was at one of our new parks here in town, and I saw a tile on the wall had been installed that said, "In loving memory of Polly Klaas." So these kind of horrific instances stay with the community. I mean, 20, 30 years later, people are still reflecting upon it. So, the decision to not seek death and to get this trial over with as soon as possible and let the community begin to heal is probably the best one.
Now, there's so much rumor in this case, Jessica. It's difficult for me to actually parse out what the evidence will actually hear and what evidence is just simply things that have been thrown around on the internet. It's funny, the local reporter who was interviewed last week indicated this was her first exposure to fake news when she covered this case at the beginning, because there was so much on the internet that was just not true. On a day like today, where you're choosing a jury for a case like this, how much do you have to get into that fake news, and how do you do that without planting the seed in the jurors' minds that actual little piece of evidence might be true, even if it's not?
Yeah, if I was the defense attorney, obviously the juror questionnaires will get into this as well. They'll be able to find out, what have people heard, and strike people who can't be fair, or ask that people recuse themselves who can't be fair based on what they've heard. There are a lot of allegations out there on the internet. This happens in all the cases, the high profile cases. I mean, if you look right now on the internet at the Las Vegas shooter, there's all sorts of speculation out there. And I think human beings want to understand why a crime like this is committed. So when we don't have that kind of information, we sort of tend to make things up that would make sense because our brain really wants to make sense of something. But unfortunately, sometimes you just can't make sense of such a senseless crime, or we just don't have the information or the facts. So the other thing, for those who haven't heard or haven't been keeping up on the internet, hopefully nobody on the jury will be, actively reading about this on the internet and won't have already done so. But for those who have not been, there's a lot of allegations of him being involved in gangs and involved in drugs. Some of that's going to be up to the judge, what comes in the trial and what the jury actually hears. Because so far it doesn't seem like there is a gang motive for this case. So whether or not that sort of prior bad act, bad character evidence would actually come in is going to be up to the judge to figure out if it's more probative than prejudicial.
And the same holds true for those other crimes as well, whether or not those other crimes get in. And that's going to be, most likely, those decisions have already been made, right? That would have been raised by a motion in limine, it's called, or a motion to preclude, even before you start jury selection, so that nobody sort of says something that they shouldn't be saying today while they're picking a jury. So the lawyers probably know what they're working with. It's just we who will be watching who don't yet know.
Yes, absolutely. And again, just as a defense attorney, you can ask the jury to be truthful with you, but there's going to be a lot of information out there. It's going to be really hard to pick a jury that has not read about this case or does not have any knowledge of this case. And I imagine they'll end up with some jurors who do have knowledge of it, but say that it's not going to influence their decision and that they can be impartial.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about is Jessica herself. Her boyfriend, Travis Sanford, was in jail at the time. Apparently, she had become romantically involved with Quentin Tellis, the defendant, according to reports that we're getting. How much do you think the defense attorney will have to put Jessica on trial in order to raise the specter of other potential killers? And do you think that's a good strategy?
As you were saying that, I was just thinking to myself, that's not a good strategy. Putting the victim who has been burned on 93% of her body and literally crawled feet to try and save her own life and then died within hours on trial is not going to be a successful strategy. There's ways to raise these kind of issues, raise questions in the jury's mind as to what's really going on there. But I would never, put on any witness who's going to make any sort of character assertions or try and speculate that, she's in any way to blame for this.
Absolutely. But it's going to be a tightrope for the defense to walk, because they're going to have to bring out the fact that there were these different interactions that Jessica may have had and these different people that she may have associated with. And I agree with you 100%. It is a bad idea in a case as terrible and horrific as this to even have the iota that you might be blaming her for this. And that's going to be a very, we talk about it as if, well, they just have to avoid this and stay with this. But that's a really tough thing for a defense attorney, isn't it?
Yeah, and I always say that whenever I'm speculating on any of these trials and analyzing, it's easy to do that job from this chair. When you're sitting there in a trial, there are a lot of things going on. You've got the media hounding you, you've got people in the courtroom, you're worried about the jurors, you're worried about what calls the judge is going to make. If you're unlucky, you've got a client who's pulling on your shirt the whole time, wanting to whisper to you because they obviously have a big stake in the outcome and want to be actively involved a lot of the time. You've got family members and victims, and it's a very difficult position to be in. And in some ways, that's why it's so great that they're not seeking death in this case, right? There's a lot that goes on. There's a lot that can cause a defense counsel to be ineffective. And unfortunately, when you're in a death case, that's somebody's life that you're responsible for. So even though, you do get a direct appeal and a habeas appeal afterwards, it's very, very hard to show ineffective assistance of counsel because there's so much speculation as to what counsel was actually, what strategy they were pursuing. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that strategy can change. You have to be pretty fluid because you never know what's going to come out that at the spur of the moment that actually forces you to switch your entire strategy and make some, overnight decisions, overnight if you're lucky, perhaps recess decisions that change the entire course of the trial.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing that people don't understand for trial attorneys is that you can within the matter of minutes, your entire case can change based on what someone says from the witness stand. And you have to be able to yield, and you have to be able to pivot, and you have to be able to do that on a dime. And it's so easy, as you said, for us to look and say, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. But having prepared a case in one way and then have to change it while someone is testifying is certainly a challenge. And it's something that may actually happen in this case with such confusing testimony. I think there's over 40 witnesses. I mean, any one of those could say something that could change the specter of this case completely, right?
Absolutely. And, it can be in the middle of questioning somebody. You have your list of questions, you've prepped the witnesses, but you never know, maybe you've missed something and the prosecution's going to evoke a different answer than you would have expected that causes you to pivot even in the moment of questioning somebody. So, it's very difficult. Like you said, these are the safe seats sitting right here. I'm not envious of the defense in this case. They're walking a very, very fine line, balancing a whole lot of things and dealing with an extremely emotional case. The jury's going to see the autopsy photos. The jury is going to hear heart-wrenching testimony from those first responders who found her on the scene. And of course, they're going to hear heart-wrenching testimony from her mother and see the gas station cameras showing her alive and well shortly before this happened.
Jessica, you're getting rave reviews from our chat room about the level of information you have about this case, which we certainly appreciate. I'm going to give them the opportunity to ask you a few questions, so I'm going to hold you for a few minutes while I just see if they have any questions. But while I do that, I want to go back and talk a little bit more about Cut 50, because I'm sure that you run into people who think that someone like Quentin Tellis should have just been locked away for the rest of his life and then this wouldn't have happened. Let's talk first about your counter to this, because I know that you have a strong one, your counter to that argument. And then I want you to tell us a little bit more about if there are people who are watching who want to find out more about Cut 50, where they can find that. But first, counter that argument that says, well, if we had just locked him up for life for that crime of burglary, Jessica Chambers might have been alive.
Well, see, the truth is there's 2.2 million people who are incarcerated here in America. 90% of them are going to be coming home. Which is why at Cut 50, we're so heavy to emphasize the fact that we need to be changing what we're actually doing in prisons. We need to be changing who's actually going to prisons and trying to divert as many people from going to prisons in the first place, and instead put our resources into actually addressing the underlying reason behind their crime. So currently on a national basis, of those 90% who come home, 74% of them are going to end up back in jail or prison. That's extremely high recidivism rate, and it doesn't need to be that high. What we know is that there are models out there that work. Everybody cites to Norway or Sweden. I'm Swedish, so I'm a little biased. I'll give them some love and say, their systems work because they treat people as human beings. They actually make sure they need the resources, they get the resources they need so that when they come home, they're not dealing with the same issues that sent them there and caused them to commit that first crime. We also know that when people come home, it's extremely hard for them to find housing and jobs. It's almost impossible once you have a felony on your record to be able to find a place to live and be able to find a way to provide for yourself or your family. So oftentimes people are left with really no options but to go back to committing crime. And of course, that's a horrible decision to make. But having worked on so many cases where I see people who have cycled through this system and I see, how detrimental it's been to their lives, just to really come out and have no options. So we have to work hard to make sure that people are able to get jobs and able to get housing when they're coming home, and that's where our resources are focused. And we should also be working hard on the front end to make sure that, if you've got mental illness and that causes you to commit a crime, that we're actually getting you the treatment you need to get better, as opposed to putting you in a prison where the traumatic environment might actually make you worse. If you have a drug problem, we need to make sure that you're getting the help you need to get off drugs. If you lack education, we need to make sure that it's available for everybody in prisons to get GEDs and job trainings and actually have some support when they're coming home to get those jobs. So there are more effective models out there. They exist. We need to scale them, and we need to make sure that our emphasis is not just punitive, but on rehabilitation.
And where can people find out more about Cut 50? And then I have a million questions for you from the audience if you have time. But where can people? I want to make sure that we give the plug to your business, to your the thing that you're directing, and what is clearly such a passion. So where can people find out more about Cut 50?
So you can find out more on cut50.org. You can also follow us on Twitter, #Cut50. And on Facebook as well. And, we really take a strong approach of humanization and legislation. So when you go to our website, you're not just going to find out about the 4 bills we just passed here in California and the 2 federal bills we're working on, but you're also going to find a lot of stories. You're going to hear directly from the guys inside. We've got a wonderful prison program called First Watch, where we actually gave the cameras to some of these guys inside who have been convicted of serious crimes such as murder, and let them tell their own stories. You'll also hear about some of the folks we helped bring home last year through the Clemency Now campaign who had been incarcerated in federal prisons. So you're going to hear a lot about the issue and see some really cool stuff.
I think that sounds fabulous. If you guys want to hear more, be sure to check her out on Facebook, Twitter, or on her website. In the meantime, though, we have a lot of questions for you. Two people, Cookie and one other, asked whether or not the other murder that Tellis is accused of, whether or not you think that will come in. Now, I know that neither of us know what the judge's rulings have been, so this is all just our best, most educated guess. But why don't you answer that question first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, there's a chance it is going to come in. As you said, we don't know for sure, but given that it was also a young woman, given that there was a robbery motive, I believe, in that case, with him using the ATM or the debit card afterwards to make withdrawals. So, maybe as they're looking at motive, trying to figure out what the motive might be, if there was anything that was missing in this case, if there was anything that was similar that would establish any sort of pattern between the two homicides, then it would be likely to come in.
I agree 100%. I think that in any of those cases, guys, it's not black and white. It is a weighing, and every judge is going to weigh things differently. Every attorney is going to argue things differently to try to affect how the judge is going to give these things weight. And here, I think that if there are similarities, as Jessica said, it will weigh towards allowing it in. But we will find out as soon as tomorrow, because a lot of times the judges will give the rulings on those types of things because they want to make sure that when the attorneys give their openings, they're not saying anything that they're not supposed to. So we'll have a really good heads up onto some of these answers to some of these questions by tomorrow. We had two people who, Marilyn and Caper, were both asking about a special that was on CNN last night about this case. And I didn't have the chance to watch that special, so I don't want to speak to that specifically. But in general, when you have this type of media coverage of a case the day before jury selection on a national level, does that concern you, number one, that the jury pool may be tainted by that, and number two, that it may bring out people who actually want to serve because they want to be involved in something that's national news?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen cases where jurors got book deals for serving on the jury, right? So, I think this is an issue. Again, you want a juror that is not going to be biased. That's very hard. Some of us have biases that we don't even recognize as in biases, right? Implicit biases. So having heard this in the media and heard all the details, and I also did not get a chance to watch the special. I intended to, but unfortunately, the county above ours had a horrific fire, and I was watching that instead. But the fact that it's on CNN, the fact that everybody in town is going to be talking about it because of its national profile, people, it's all over the media. So they're going to have to sequester the jury, would be my guess here, to make sure that no additional information is coming to them. But it's really hard to know what has poisoned the pool of potential jurors and how forthcoming they will be about their feelings regarding this case based on what they've heard.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because it's something that a lot of people are concerned about when we've got this kind of coverage. Another great question, and something that I think was touched upon on Friday with one of the reporters who's local to that area, and I'm definitely going to ask the reporter this afternoon. But do you know, and if not, I'll try to lead us to it. There's claim that Jessica actually said a name when she was found. And if you don't have any information on that, Jessica, I do, but I wanted to see first, do you know what that name was and whether or not that name has become a major piece of evidence?
So it could be a major piece of evidence. So here's the thing about that. So when the first responders got there on scene, and they rushed up to her, obviously they see the car on fire, they see her laying there a little distance from the car. Supposedly they asked her, who did this? How did this happen? And she said, Derek or Eric.
Right.
Now, of course, we know that the defendant in this case is named Quentin. So they sound very, very different to us. But there will be, I believe, some expert testimony coming that talks about the amount of smoke inhalation and the damage that had been done to her esophagus and to her throat that may have made it difficult. Because remember, she was burned. 93% of her body was burned. There's also smoke inhalation. That may have made it difficult for her to speak and actually pronounce the name correctly. So, of course, as defense, I would be jumping on the fact that She had said somebody else's name at the scene of the
Yep.
crime. If I was the prosecution, I'd be pointing to expert testimony regarding the conditions of her ability to speak and actually articulate a name properly.
So, Sarah Joy, it's a great question because it's going to be a major issue in the case. That was a question by Sarah Joy, and I'm interested to see. I mean, Jessica, I think you hit the nail on the head from both perspectives. It's a piece of evidence that's going to be heavily argued, I think, by both sides of this case. We have another question. One, Sherry asked whether the jury is sequestered. We know that this jury is sequestered, Sherry, but on top of that, it's a situation where the lawyers and everyone went 200 miles away to pick this jury, and then the jury is going to be bussed into the local courthouse and be sequestered 200 miles from their homes. Now, Jessica, how does that impact the ability to get a good jury in a case like this when they have to be sequestered far away from home for up to 2 weeks?
Well, I think the purpose behind it, obviously, is to limit the amount of information, right? If you're going home, if you're serving on a case, and you go home every night and tell your husband, I've been at this case all day. Obviously, they want to know more about it. They're watching the news. They might say something that's been on the news. You're likely to see the papers. Once you sequester a jury, you have a little more control over the information they're getting. Their televisions will not allow them to watch the news on this case. They're not going to be getting the papers, the local papers that would have information about the case. So the idea is to make the jury as impartial as possible so that there can be a fair trial. Now, obviously, the jury is not going to enjoy being sequestered. You're picked up and taken away from your family for a couple weeks. That's difficult, but hopefully they realize that the goal is to keep them as impartial as possible and protect, whatever the verdict may be, the sanctity of that verdict and the process.
We have two good questions from Stacy Lynn. One I think we talked about briefly before, but I just want to touch upon it so that she gets her question answered, and that's why no death penalty in this case? You went through some of the reasons, but don't you think that that is an issue that is multifaceted? It has to do with conversations with the family. It has to do with mitigating factors. It has to do with the likelihood of appeal. It has to do with the amount of money that the prosecutor is willing to spend, and all of those things go together to make the decision whether or not to pursue the death penalty.
Absolutely. It's a variety of factors. There is no formula, which is why, it's sort of arbitrary. The death penalty is pretty arbitrary because you could take the same set of case facts in two different towns with two different prosecutors and have two completely different decisions as to whether or not they actually seek death penalty. So, that goes into the argument of kind of how arbitrary the system is itself. But it's a lot of different factors that prosecutor is going to be weighing when he made that decision.
The other question that Stacy Lynn had, I wish I could find it in the actual feed because it was a good question as worded, and I'm not going to be able to word it quite the same. But she talked about whether or not, do you think that the system of halfway houses and those types of programs post-prison has been an abject failure due to the high rate of recidivism? And I think that I know your answer, given what we've already talked about with Cut 50, but how would you respond to that?
Listen, I'll respond with an anecdote. I was just in Kentucky a few weeks ago, and I was at a county jail. I was talking to a woman who was there who unfortunately was going through the detox process. And telling me, this was not her first time ending up in that jail because of opioid addiction. She said that when she got to that halfway house, when she left last time, she was completely clean. They actually have a pretty amazing program down there that helps people get clean and get on medicine-assisted treatment for opioid addiction while they're incarcerated, sign up for Medicaid so they can continue to get the treatment once they're out. But she said that the broken link was really that there wasn't a regulation of that halfway house. So unfortunately, the halfway house she went to didn't have a whole lot of support. And I think that's a big problem that we see. It's inconsistent. You might go to a halfway house that has a lot of support and that is able to keep you on track with your treatment and getting a job and finding, a permanent place to live. Or you might go to one where you're expected to start paying in money right away. You're unable to get the resources you need to get better. So I would not say that halfway houses themselves are abject failure, transitional housing can be very helpful, but it is a case-by-case basis at this point, and we need stronger regulations for our halfway houses, as well as more supports inside the prison. Rehabilitation and planning for your reentry should start the day you get to prison, as opposed to 60 days before release or 30 days before release.
So Stacey, that's a perfect question for Jessica. She is on top of that. Here's some factual questions that we have. Larry wanted to know, we have some camera footage of the gas station, one of the last times that Jessica was seen. And he's wondering, and this is an interesting question, whether we think there's more camera footage that we haven't seen from that, given that today there's cameras almost everywhere. Do you think we'll see more camera footage over the course of this case?
So I'll tell you again, sort of anecdotally, on cases that I've worked on, there are cameras everywhere, and now that people have cell phones, that's only increased. The question is, whether or not they were able to get out there and get the footage immediately. I've ended up, coming back, looking around a crime scene, realizing there's a camera, going and asking a store owner for the footage, and it turns out it's just a camera to scare people away, or it turns out they have it on loop for recording, and they've recorded over whatever happened the day before or the week before. So it depends. I imagine the police have done a very thorough job in this case, going out there and getting all the camera evidence that they can from all the security cameras they can. So whatever is out there, I'm sure they've already got it.
Now, one other question. At some point in that video, this is another question from Sarah Joy. At some point in that video, someone called her, and she walks back into the gas station to speak with someone. That she wants to know whether anyone knows who that person is, or what part that person may play at trial. I don't personally haven't seen any reports on that. Have you?
I have not seen any reports on that. I did, I know they have the cell phone evidence, right? That's sort of how they triangulated the defendant's position and everything. So I do not know who it was she talked to, but I'm sure we will be finding out at trial. I'm sure they will talk about what that conversation was like, what was said, what kind of mind frame she was in.
Yeah, it's funny, our trial watchers always hone right in on the most important things, and the things that they have been asking you about this morning certainly seem to be the things that I think will be most important at this trial as well. Jessica, I can't tell you how much everyone appreciates your preparation and your experience and the information you bring to bear on this particular issue with Cut 50. So thank you so much for being with us this morning. I hope that you'll come back again soon.
Of course, I love it. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day.